Welcome to the Everyday Farmers Conference. It's all about getting started with small ruminants. Today I have Kate Johnson, and we're going to talk about dairy products, both edible and non-edible, and just have a really awesome conversation about what you can do with goat's milk specifically, but there will be a little bit of sheep's milk. And so, Kate, can you just introduce yourself, and then we'll get into the talk.
Sure. I'm Kate Johnson, and I raise Nubian dairy goats. I have raised some other breeds as well. We started with mini Nubians, and then we switched to full size Nubians, and we've had Nigerian dwarfs, and we actually had some Oberhaslis for a little while too. But the Nubians sort of won out, and they're my favorite breed, and so we raised these Nubian dairy goats in Colorado, and then we started them as a 4-H project. In fact, I realized I have my 4-H hat on today, and I am now a 4-H leader, and I'm also a superintendent for our fair. But I also spun off a completely new career for myself after having this wonderful goat's milk for a few years and learning how to make cheese myself from the milk. And a lot of people really wanted to learn to make cheese. So I started teaching as a hobby for several years. And eventually it just kept growing so much that I think it was 2014, we actually launched a formal cheese making school. It has been a brick and mortar in-person classroom up until the pandemic. Now we are entirely virtual for the time being. We will go back to in-person classes when it's safe to do that. So that's been a lot of fun. So that cheese making school is the art of cheese. And although I started it because I have dairy goats, we do teach all types of cheese making from all types of milk, including what you can get at the grocery store.
So one of the people I talked to talked about the fact that at least on the sheep end, you can't do sheep milk breeds in 4-H. Is that different for goats, or is that the same?
It probably depends on where you are, because all 4-H programs are, although it is a national program, there are different projects in different parts of the country. So here where I am, there are no dairy sheep projects, and I haven't ever heard of any. And I think part of that, as you know, being a dairy sheep owner, part of that is because the United States is so far behind in the cultivation of dairy sheep breeds compared to dairy cows and dairy goats. And so I don't know of any dairy sheep programs, but that's not to say there couldn't be one. If somebody were in a community and really wanted to do dairy sheep, a lot of 4-H chapters are open to whatever people want. For instance, we didn't have an alpaca program here, and we had a group of kids that wanted to do alpacas and a farm that said they'd do it. And so we started an alpaca program. So I wouldn't say it could never happen, but it probably isn't as common as dairy goats for sure.
But your chapter does do dairy goats.
We do. We do 4 different goat projects, actually. So we do dairy goats and market goats and fiber goats. And then a few years ago, we added a 4th thing that is starting to become more popular around the country. We call it utility goats. And that happens to be what I'm the superintendent for. I assist in the dairy goat area, and then I run the utility goat program. Basically, what it started out as was a program that gave the boys something to do, the boy goats, something to do, because of course in the dairy world, we all want the girls, and then what do you do with all these boys? And if you castrate, a male goat or probably sheep, they calm down and they make a nice kind of pet or project. So our kids teach the utility goats to hike with them and carry packs, and then at the fair, we have them do obstacle courses that would simulate being out on a trail, and they pull carts and they have their own showmanship and their own conformation. It's actually the biggest goat show at our fair, which is really funny because it's sort of a made up category.
Yeah, that sounds amazing though, just to be like, what a great hole that you guys found and kind of started to do something with.
Yeah, and it was also a really nice way for kids who really wanted to get into a goat project, and they didn't particularly want to do market goats because they wanted to have more of a pet that they could keep. but maybe they didn't want to spend the money on a dairy doe or do the work of raising an animal for milk because it's a lot different. And so the Wethers was just a good, we call it the gateway drug, the gateway goat to dairy, because, they do the Wethers for a year or two, and then they'd realize, oh, this is so fun. And if I had a doe too, I could show in 2 different projects. And almost all the kids that started with just a Wether ended up getting a doe within the next year or two. So it
Uh-huh.
actually grew our dairy goat program just as much as it grew the utility goat program. And then, like you said, it did fill this need. A lot of people really didn't like the ideas of selling their Wethers for meat, although that is an option and some people do. But this was a way for them to be able to keep at least a few of the boys and have something productive to do with them.
Yeah, and what a great if you have boys, to be able to connect with, a boy animal.
Yeah,
Um,
right. We don't just throw
you know,
you away. Yeah.
right? Because I was like, yeah, it's very much like the first animals on our farm were all girls, and so my husband was like, "Yeah, I'm outnumbered."
Right.
Um, and then we got the boy, and he's like, "Okay, at least it's a little bit more even."
Yeah.
Um, so let's move over to go back to the dairy aspect. Um, you can milk sheep and goats. They're a little harder than cows because their teats and their udders are smaller. But that's also breeding and genetics. And so, what drew you to kind of? You guys said you kind of use the dairy for your own house, but what kind of turned you from maybe goats or cow's milk to trying goat's milk and kind of moving over in that area?
Yeah, well, I'd say we really started, in our case, we started because of the animal, whereas some people start because of the milk. So in our case, we have a fairly small property. We have about 5 acres, and we had horses too. So they're using a lot of the property. And so goats are just so much smaller than cows, much easier to manage, much easier for little kids to handle. And also, frankly, they're just less messy. Goat poop is much, much nicer to deal with than cow poop. That was from my perspective really important.
Mhm.
So we really started the goat milk thing from the animal perspective, whereas some people are switching to goat milk because of the nutrient value of the goat milk over cow milk. And so some of the things that really make goat milk maybe preferable for a lot of people, one of the biggest aspects has to do with a protein that is found in most of our supply of cow milk in this country. It's called an A1 protein. And many people are either allergic to or sensitive to or can't digest the A1 protein, especially as they age. Many people mistake that as being a lactose intolerance because the symptoms are very similar, but it's actually a protein intolerance. And goat milk does not contain the A1 protein. I don't think sheep milk does either. And so it only contains the A2 protein. And so it's just way more digestible for more people. And then in addition to that, goat milk does have less lactose, although it has enough lactose that if you truly were lactose intolerant, you couldn't drink goat milk either. And
Mhm.
then goat milk also has a smaller fat molecule, and that also makes it easier to digest. And then there are a whole bunch of other nutritional benefits to goat milk. In terms of, calcium content is higher. Lots of the other vitamins and minerals are higher in goat milk. So a lot of people switch from cow milk to goat milk, and then they find out that buying goat milk is really expensive and there isn't as big of a market in their grocery store. And if they have the means to do it, having a backyard goat is a great way to do it. And many of the dairy breeds have become very easy to milk. And I would argue, I've had a lot of people that have milked goats, sheep, and cows, and most would argue goats are far easier than any of those because we're quite a ways along in this country in cultivating very milkable breeds. And in fact, the Nigerian dwarf, which was the last sanctioned miniature dairy goat breed, has come a really long way in its milkability, meaning that the teat size and the udder size, and the amount they produce has just incredibly increased and improved. And so they're quite milkable. Also, I think because they only have two teats, it makes them really easy to milk by hand because you got two hands, whereas a cow has four, and most people use a machine with a cow.
Yeah, and I think goats are generally easier to stand train, I would say, if
Oh,
you
for
don't have.
sure.
So we're stand training ours, and two of them are fine. And we have sheep, and two of them are fine. Two of them are now terrified of it, because we don't have a ramp. We just were trying to teach them to jump up, and two of them were like, no way.
Yeah, I hear that. I
Um,
hear sheep don't like to jump. Goats love it. I
yeah,
mean, goats just thrive on jumping on things.
yeah,
So you only have to feed them in the stanchion once, and
yeah,
then they're pretty much like, woohoo,
yeah.
they
So
love
they're
it.
like, there's food up there. There's no problem
Yeah,
jumping up.
especially the babies. I mean, I always stand train my babies. By the time they're starting to eat grain at about 3 or 4 months, they start getting their stand training. And then it becomes a problem of just not having them all charge the gate and want to run out into the milk house because they know what's in there and they're pretty excited.
Yeah, they know what's coming. And I'll add to the whole food sensitivities because I have a lot of them. And we found out that I couldn't do cow. And then we tested a few with goats and I couldn't seem to handle goat either. And so
Interesting.
sheep milk was the only, we tried like sheep cheese and that like pure sheep cheese, manchego, and it was the only one that my stomach could handle. So we were like, oh, well then I guess sheep's milk is kind of, I don't know what the difference is to the minutest degree, what the difference between goat and sheep milk, but my body knows.
Yeah,
And it says one's okay and one's not. And that's why we got into ours, is ours was
interesting.
more from the milk aspect of, well, if you want any dairy whatsoever, there's no sheep's milk like you can buy at the store. There's just
Right.
like you said, with goats, they're a little farther along. You're more likely to find them. You go to Sprouts and you see like the goat one with not there's not as many there's
Right.
usually maybe one or two
Hmm.
bottles or brands versus cow cow's milk, but there's nothing for sheep. And
Right.
so ours was just a kind of, we didn't have a choice. Because I tell people, I was like, I was not mentally in the mindset of wanting to be a farmer. um I was kind of okay with my husband doing it all. um but then this whole thing happened a few years ago and I was like, you know what, I like ice cream too much to not have it ever again. And I
Yeah.
was like, so we need to do at least a little bit. And so that's kind of what started our journey. But that was definitely, you said you went at it kind of as the animal, and we ended up doing it through the milk. And there's just
Right.
different avenues that you go through, um to kind of get to dairy sheep. Because I think,
Yes.
it's easier to buy it at the store. It just is. It may not be cheaper, but it's, you run to the store and you pick it up and you're done. Versus,
Yeah, although sometimes I say in the long run, it probably is cheaper to buy it at the grocery store because,
yeah,
and I think that is something people have to realize, that animal husbandry is expensive. I mean, especially, and we were talking before we started recording of the vet care, for an animal. There's a lot that you have to learn to do yourself in order to make it affordable. And then, but for us, it was also a lifestyle thing. I mean, our kids were small when we started with the farm and the dairy animals, and it was just a great way to get them outdoors and teach them about responsibility and teach them about the cycle of life. You see a lot of births, and you see a little bit of death, and all of those things to us made it really worth. And then also just the fact that we know how these animals are treated. And so, the dairy industry on a large scale is a pretty dirty industry, both from a treatment standpoint and even just from an ecological standpoint. So I think small scale dairy farming is a lot gentler to the earth, and it's a lot gentler to the animals. And
mhm,
so for us, there were a lot of philosophical reasons. It wasn't so much economic. Although, sometimes I feel like I have free milk because I just go out to the milk house and milk the animal. Now I've got milk. If I don't pay attention to all the bills that went into producing that milk, but it's just so much more rewarding. Plus the fact that we know what's in that milk. We know we're not feeding, any kind of additional hormones or any kind of antibiotics or anything like that. And that also makes me feel a whole lot better about that, nutrient source.
Yeah, and it's funny that you talked about the weathers being kind of the gateway for some of your kids, because a lot of what I've heard from just people I've talked to is that 4-H itself, like for their kids, is what got them in, like the adults into it, which I found really really interesting. That they're like, yeah, my kids kind of went through it, but then we just kind of kept at it. Um,
Yeah, well, that's why a lot of people, when their kids age out of 4-H, because my kids are 21 and 24 now, so they've been out of 4-H for a while. A lot of them do sell off, the kids' animal projects. And no, not me. I kept them and built a business around them, and I have way more goats now than we had during our 4-H years. And probably part of that is I didn't get to do 4-H as a kid. Like you, I was a city girl, and
mhm.
I always wanted to live on a farm, and I had a horse growing up that I boarded. And and so for me, this was my chance to do, what I didn't get to do as a kid. And 4-H is really a family activity. So the parents are generally almost as involved as the kids. And many of us do stick around as volunteers long after our kids have aged out. It's a
Yeah,
great program.
I'd never heard of 4-H growing up. It was only until I met my husband, because his sisters went through it. He was a city boy too until they moved, but he was too old to get into it when they moved, and so his sisters went through it. And I was like, "What is 4-H?"
Yeah.
Like, explain to me
Yeah.
what that is, because I don't what like we have fairs in our city, but it wasn't something that my family really did.
Well, and a
Um,
lot of people mistakenly think that 4-H is only for country kids. That's what I thought. My cousins lived in the country and they did 4-H, and I lived in the city and I did Girl Scouts,
yes, that's what I
And
did.
as it turns out, you don't even have to have livestock to do 4-H.
Mhm.
There's a whole lot of programs that aren't even animal related. There's, sewing and cooking and bicycle repair and citizenship. And, there's a lot of things. So it is actually a program that is available in many communities, whether you have the rural part or not. And I didn't just know all that until I got into it from the goat angle. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, which is just it's fun to hear about 4-H from people, because I definitely want to get my girls, or
Yeah.
my girl and my boy, into it when they hit their age. So I want to talk a little bit about what naturally homogenized milk means. Because a lot of people don't, like, we'll say goats and sheep's milk are naturally homogenized, and people go, "What?"
What? Yeah, right.
So can you explain a little bit about what that means and why it's beneficial for goats and sheep's milk versus cows that aren't?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the fat molecule in the goat milk and the sheep milk is much smaller. And so what happens with cow milk, because that fat molecule is so big, it separates out from the rest of the milk. And so, if you milk a cow and you put that milk in the refrigerator, the cream rises to the top and you have this big cream line or a big bunch of cream on top, and you skim that cream off and the milk underneath is skim milk. So that's kind of where that terminology comes from. Well, when you go to the grocery store to buy cow milk, most of the time you don't have that cream line because that milk has been homogenized. It has been mechanically homogenized. And what that means is they're basically using pressure, high pressure, to force the milk through these real thin mesh screens to break down the fat molecules so that they're really small. In fact, what the homo part of homogenized means is same, and it makes them the same size as all the other uh, um, solids in the milk. So things like the proteins and the minerals, and then they stay all suspended in the milk rather than rising to the top. Well, goat milk and sheep milk, because the fat molecules are already so small naturally, they are naturally homogenized, meaning that their cream doesn't separate out, at least not as readily or as much. Now, sometimes, especially if you have a really high fat producing animal, and sheep are much higher butter fat producing than goats, some of that cream will separate out over time when it's in a cold condition. And but instead of using a mechanical homogenizer, goat milk and sheep milk people have to do like the opposite. If we want to get that cream, we have to use a mechanical cream separator in order to get the cream. So that's the difference. Now, because of that, two things that are really great about goat milk and sheep milk. It is easier to digest because that fat molecule is easier for you to break down. It takes about 20 minutes to digest the same size serving of goat milk that takes 2 hours to digest for cow milk, because it's much harder for your body to digest that fat molecule. And then from a kind of cheese making perspective, or yogurt making, or whatever food product you're going to try to coagulate, it's less processed, because that homogenization process damages the structure of the milk a little bit, with the cow milk, and makes it a little harder to turn it into cheese or yogurt or what have you. And so that non-homogenized, naturally homogenized is what they really call it, sheep and goat milk are much easier to turn into one of these wonderful food products.
Yeah, I've seen somebody who has made butter from sheep's milk, which is not easy. I think they still have to put I don't know if this particular person used a separator. I think they just left it in the fridge for but it takes a long
Right.
time than for cows. I think it was like 5 or 6 days versus like cows where it's probably like a day or two maybe.
Yeah, right.
So it's like a lot of things that you make with cow's milk, you can make with sheep's, but like you said, it's just a different component. It's whether you want the fat in it or whether you need the fat to come out of it.
Right.
And that kind of will affect how you make those things. Um, so one of the things that I know you and I have talked about in previous talks is the fact that for at least goats, you can't freeze, or it's not beneficial to freeze the goat's milk, that it doesn't thaw well.
For making cheese,
Yeah.
yes. So if you're going to have to freeze it for other reasons, for instance, I make a lot of goat milk soap, and you actually want to freeze the milk for that and then partially thaw it, because part of that chemical reaction in making soap generates a lot of heat, and the frozen milk helps that. And then I also make goat milk caramels, and I find that I can use frozen milk for that as well. But for cheese, goat milk, it just separates funny when you thaw it back out, and it doesn't work very well. Now, I have had sheep milk. We don't have a huge supply of sheep milk, which is why you have sheep. Most of us don't have good access to sheep milk in this country, because we just don't have the breeds here that are as easy or as profitable to milk. And so when I used to be able to get sheep milk, we were getting it from a creamery that would drive to Nebraska to pick up the sheep milk from a big sheep dairy and bring it back here frozen. And we had no problem making cheese out of that frozen and then thawed sheep milk. And I think cow milk, similarly, you could use frozen and turn that into cheese, but goat milk just doesn't work so well. Not that you can't do it at all, but it definitely changes the texture of your cheese.
And it probably depends on what cheese you're trying to make too.
Yeah. I mean, my very first cheese making experience, I actually toted frozen milk across the country to my vacation place, because I thought it would take so much time to make the cheese that I needed to clean my slate, and make it so I didn't have anything to do, which I laughed because it was really, really easy once I actually sat down to do it. So that very first cheese I made was made with frozen goat milk. And I thought it turned out, pretty good until I made it with fresh goat milk. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's way different and way better.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting. If I was a history major, so I always like to go back in history. Before we had refrigerators, a lot of the things you do with milk was for preservation.
Exactly.
And so a lot of the cheeses were because, you only milked the animal for a certain time, and then that milk either went bad because you weren't drinking it quick enough, or you just didn't have as many family members who needed it. and so they turned it into other things so that it lasted longer. Um,
Exactly. And it makes it smaller, right? So,
yeah,
imagine trying to carry, 5 gallons of sloshing milk across the desert as you're being a nomad traveling, right? But you could turn that 5 gallons of sloshing milk into 5 pounds of a hard cheese that would be very easy to transport. So
yeah.
I always say that cheese was a way to make milk smaller and make it last longer.
I would say that too, even now, when you have your own dairy animals, you could have all that milk in the fridge.
It's
Or
so
you
true.
can do the, I think, people make some of their like homemade cheese caves, or what are they called? They're cheese caves?
Yeah, for aging. Yeah.
Yes. Where you can, put them off somewhere else that, if you have that kind of area, so it's not taking up your freezer or your fridge.
Oh,
Um,
yes. Well, I always say, I didn't set out to be a cheesemaker, let alone to open a cheesemaking school. It was by necessity. We were only milking one goat at the time, but she was giving a gallon a day. So, I mean, no way could a family afford drink a gallon of milk a day, right? And so I really started making cheese just because I had to figure out something to do with all this milk. And it just happens that that kind of caught on and became really a whole new chapter in my life. Really fun.
I find that one of the questions I see a lot is, I have a family of 4, or I have a family of 6, I have a family of this many, how many animals do I need to, produce that, or to feed, to have that milk go and be available for everybody. And a lot of the response I get back is, well, it depends on your breed. It
Yeah.
depends on how much that particular animal that you have in your backyard is producing. It also depends on how much your family goes through. Um,
Hmm.
and so like people are like, well, if you don't know, take regular milk and see how much you use in a week. And then that can gauge on like what kind of animal, what breed. If you don't need a ton of milk, you can go with a breed that maybe isn't technically a dairy breed, but maybe is better for your personality or for your homestead or your location. Um, versus if you're like either turning it into a business, or you have a very large family and need, an animal or two to produce a decent amount.
Right.
Um,
And I think you also have to factor in, do you just want milk in the liquid form to drink? Or do you want to make goat yogurt or milk, homemade yogurt and homemade cheeses and homemade soaps and lotions and all the other products? Because, I would definitely only need about half a goat for the milk I drink, right? But I can easily use up, and of course, can you also sell the milk then? And that varies in different states, how you can do it and when, how much you can do and whatnot. But it is also a way, like I do sell excess milk through the raw milk CSA herd share model, which is probably how the majority of states handle small milk sales. And that does supplement, what it's costing me to produce the milk. It's certainly, at the scale I'm doing it alone is not a big money maker, but it does certainly offset the expense of having the animals.
yeah, let's talk a little bit about, since you brought it up, raw versus pasteurized.
Yeah.
Both in just how you do it, but also in what the politics are around that.
Yes,
Not
it's
like the do you believe in it or not, but just how the government itself addresses that.
for sure. Yeah. So, just some terminology. I mean, some people don't even really understand what these things mean. So, when milk comes out of the animal, it's raw. And for centuries, that's how everybody drank their milk because most of us had a dairy animal right next door, or right next in our backyard. We were farmers, we were goat herders or sheep herders. And so we had easy access to that milk. And so for centuries, that raw milk model just went fine. Where the real problem started with raw milk was around industrialization, when people were moving away from where the product was being produced. They were moving to the cities where the jobs were, and the animals were still out in the country. And milk, I often say, wants to be cheese. Milk by itself, left alone, will become cheese pretty quickly. And what I mean by that is if you don't have a lot of refrigeration, all of the natural ingredients for making cheese are in your milk, and with a little heat it will curdle, right? And curdled, we might call that spoiled milk now, but it's essentially cheese. It's where the curds have separated out. So during this time where people were far away from the source, the milk, by the time it would get to them, wasn't really liquid milk anymore. So then they got this great idea, let's move the animals to the city where the people are, and then they can get the milk quicker. Well, that's when the real problems with raw milk started, because those conditions where the animals weren't very good, right? They were crowded, and the people that were working in the conditions were also living in crowded situations, and we didn't have a lot of good hygiene. We didn't even have good plumbing systems. And basically that's when raw milk started killing people. And it wasn't necessarily that the milk itself was the problem, but the health of the animals and then the hygiene in the situations where they were being milked were the problems, because milk is a great host for really bad bacteria in addition to good bacteria, right? So that's when I think raw milk started to get really villainized. I mean, people were dying from this raw milk. And so we started pasteurizing milk. So Louis Pasteur was working in the wine industry and had learned if you heat up things to a certain temperature, you kill all this bad stuff. And so we started applying that to milk, and pasteurization became the way we processed not good for you milk, right? And so pasteurization really saved lives, and it's just heating milk to a certain temperature for a certain amount of time. But over time, it also became the way that we just do things now, right? And so most of the milk that we buy in commercially is pasteurized. And people are realizing that in addition to killing the bad stuff in the milk, we're also now killing the good stuff. And the good stuff we might refer to as probiotics. All that good bacteria in your gut needs a lot of that good bacteria. And so people are wanting raw milk again because they're realizing there's a lot of nutrient benefits to it. But by now, raw milk is heavily legislated. And so in most states, it is illegal to buy and sell raw milk. I have goats. I can access my own milk raw if I choose to, but I couldn't sell my raw milk to you. That would be illegal. And so it's become this very political issue. And there are reasons beyond health that are reasons for this. Some of it has to do with lobbying and industry and so on. But now many states have gotten around some of these legalities. Some states have outright made it legal in certain conditions. So on the West Coast, for instance, California, I know Washington, a lot of places out there, you can buy raw milk. In fact, you can buy it at a lot of grocery stores now. But in other states, like my state and many states, it's technically illegal to buy and sell raw milk, but I could sell you a share in my herd. And what that would do is you would buy into my herd, you would then pay me to board your animal and milk it for you. And I will just be giving you your milk because it's your animal. And so that's called the herd share model, or we often refer to it as a raw milk CSA, community supported agriculture. And that allows those of us who don't have a grade A dairy to have some mechanism for selling milk. And so some states have, more or less generous or difficult rules around that. Some have some rules where you can sell a certain amount on farm. And in fact, some states even allow a certain amount of on-farm cheese making that isn't in a commercial creamery. My state does not have that. We can only do the raw milk. We can't sell any other product that way that's dairy. Yeah, so that's kind of the sort of medium level explanation of all of that. So, raw milk itself, I think, the advocates of raw milk would lead you to believe that it cures cancer, right? And the FDA and many of the proponents against raw milk would lead you to believe it can kill you. And unfortunately, both of those scenarios are potentially true, right? And so the way that you handle that raw milk and the health of the animal are what's really important, because raw milk per se is gloriously wonderful, but not all raw milk is. And how you handle it and what you do with it really makes a big difference, and the health of the animal.
Well, and it's you're the cheese expert, and so there's certain cheeses you can't make unless it's raw, correct?
Well, so the way it works, if you're a commercial cheesemaker in the United States, now the Europe and other countries have different laws, but in the United States, commercial cheesemakers are only allowed to make a raw milk cheese if that cheese is going to age for 60 days or more. Now, it's not that you can't make raw milk cheeses that don't age 60 days, just legally, you're not allowed to if you are a regulated dairy.
Mm.
So, the advice the FDA gives to home cheesemakers is that we follow those same guidelines, that we too should not make cheese from raw milk unless that cheese is going to age for 60 days or more. Now, nobody is regulating you in your home setting. And so home cheesemakers can essentially do whatever they want. And really, most cheeses will work just fine with raw milk, but it's going to be a little different what you do with that cheese. And whether or not you should might just depend on how comfortable you are with your source of raw milk and how fresh it is. Raw milk cheese really was intended to be made with milk from the udder, right? You milk the animal, and now it's at that perfect cheese making temperature. You come in and you start making cheese. And that's the safest way to make raw milk cheeses. Unfortunately, since most people don't have dairy animals in their backyard, most home cheese makers, and they're wanting to use raw milk, by the time they get the raw milk, it may not be that fresh and may have been refrigerated for a while, which you might think makes it safer. But in actuality, there are some harmful bacteria that can be produced at those cold temperatures. And so you have to be careful about how you handle the milk. And then also when you're making a cultured cheese where you're adding culture, you have to do that a little bit differently with raw milk, because essentially raw milk already has a lot of culture in it because we didn't kill the bacteria during pasteurization. But essentially any cheese technically could be made with raw milk. And then there are some cheeses, like some, protected cheeses or brands or names that have to be made with raw milk. In fact, in France, they had a cheese contest. I think I read about it last year, where they expressly excluded any pasteurized milk cheeses. You could only come to this cheese contest with raw milk cheeses because they so much believe in the health benefits and the flavor benefits of raw milk.
Yeah, well, and there's also not restrictions, but like certain locations, like it's kind of like is it champagne, where like it's only technically called champagne unless if it comes from this particular place in France. And I
Right.
think that's the same with like I think manchego. Like it has to be pure sheep cheese and it has to be made in this specific location to make it called it. Not that you can't make it at home in
For
the US
sure.
somewhere,
And in
but
fact,
it's not technically this particular cheese.
exactly. I mean, those are those protected domains, but it really only pertains to in the region where it's made. So a producer here in the United States doesn't have to follow those same rules. So we often do have people that are making all kinds of cheeses and calling them that, even in a professional setting here, that really couldn't do that in Europe.
Mhm.
So yeah, it is kind of interesting. But yeah, manchego is a good example because manchego technically is a sheep milk cheese, and it's made from the La Mancha, in the La Mancha region, from the Manchego sheep in Spain. But here in the United States, you could make manchego with any sheep milk. And in fact, you could make that same recipe with cow milk with a little tweak, and then you just call it Hispanico. Or you
Yeah.
could make it with a blend of milks and then you call it Iberico. And there are some differences that you have to do in terms of the rennet amount. Rennet is the enzyme, and that particular ingredient is species specific. So you have to make some modifications, but you can make virtually any cheese out of any milk. It's just that it isn't always traditional to do that.
Yes. Well, and it's one of the things that I learned just because of my food sensitivities. It's just because it says it's a sheep cheese or it's a goat cheese doesn't mean they didn't add something like either cow or the other one, whatever it is, sheep adding a little goat or goat adding a little sheep. That they still can technically call it a goat's cheese because it's primarily goat. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not something else in there.
Right,
At
which is
least,
another benefit to making it yourself.
yeah.
Then you know exactly what is in there.
Yeah, I mean, you can look in their ingredient section, it will say that they added other things, but it won't be that big thing on the front cover.
Right.
But that's also just something to think about when you're like, if you're sensitive to stuff and you're trying it, it may say sheep cheese, just make sure what you know what's in it.
Yes.
Because you could be fine with sheep or goat, but then if they added some little bit of cow something, that could be the thing that's affecting you. Um, the other thing I wanted to throw out with just how the making of cheese or just handling milk is also the expertise aspect of it. I mean, you've been doing it for years, so you know what you're doing. I tried to pasteurize raw sheep's milk that I was able to get a hold of, um, but I didn't know what I was doing. So the first batch I did came out, and I tried it, and it didn't settle on my stomach very well. And I was like, oh no, does that mean I'm not okay with sheep's milk? And then I did a second batch and I was like, okay, no, it was just I didn't pasteurize it correctly. And it's like you either have to drink it raw or do it pasteurized. That like in between, or if you don't do it correctly, can affect the cheese and make it kind of inedible. That's why they have certain machines that do it, because there's no human error aspect.
Yeah, although it's really pretty easy, as long as you have a good thermometer and you know the temperatures and times, you don't have to have a pasteurizing machine to pasteurize your milk if you choose to do it.
Hmm.
I do pasteurize a lot of my milk, and part of that is because I'm making cheese that I'm sharing with people in classes, and I don't want to make this decision for them that they might not fully understand, because raw milk is complicated, and especially like you just had a baby, raw milk cheeses for pregnant women or raw milk itself can be potentially more dangerous than if you aren't pregnant. And I never know if somebody coming to a class is pregnant or not. They might not even know. So I do tend to err on that side of caution, but not because I think of raw milk as being villainous. It's more of a kind of more of a safety precaution for a wide spectrum
Hmm.
of end users.
Hmm. So, because we're talking about cheese, and that's obviously something you love to do,
Yes.
let's talk a little bit about just cheese. Like, how does someone who's never made cheese before kind of get started? What are some easier cheeses? What are some hard, or ones that are just a little bit more technical? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so share as much as you want.
Sure. Well, it is my second favorite topic after goats. so, with cheeses, there's lots of different ways you can categorize them. And probably one of the best categorizations is fresh versus aged cheeses. So a fresh cheese is one that you're going to work with the milk and then eat the cheese either the same day or maybe the next day. And those are by far much easier, right? You don't need as much equipment. You don't need as much time. And so that's where I usually say people should start with the fresh cheeses. Now, within fresh cheeses, you have two broad categories, and that's whether it's a cultured cheese or whether it's what I call a direct acidification cheese. Is the way we get milk to become cheese on purpose. Like I said, milk wants to be cheese, and really all you have to do is leave it alone. But what makes that milk curdle is primarily spoilage bacteria. And so by the time that happens accidentally, the cheese doesn't taste all that good and might not make you feel all that great. So, but the chemistry is the same when we actually are making cheese on purpose. We're just adding some things to speed up the process. So what's happening when you get the solids to separate from the liquid is the first step is you have to acidify, change the pH level in the milk, because that will make the curds separate out. And the curds are just the solid things that are in your milk: protein, butter, fat, calcium, phosphorus. They make up about 1/8 of the volume of your milk, and the rest of your milk is essentially water. And so you're going to be separating out the solids, which become the curds, from the liquid, which becomes the whey. So this acidification can happen two ways. One is, and the way it's made with most cheese, you add culture, which is bacteria, and that bacteria converts lactose to lactic acid. That process takes a little bit longer, And it involves culture, which you have to usually buy from a cheese making supply. You can make your own cultures out of raw milk or kefir grains, but most of us are buying a culture from a cheese making supply house. The quicker way to do it is to just directly acidify it. Instead of adding culture to produce acid, you just add acid. So the really quick, easy cheeses are these cheeses that you use acid, like vinegar or lemon juice or citric acid, and they usually require heat. So most of the time, cheese making is done more around room temperature, but the direct acidification cheeses are hot. They're cooked. So think of ricotta, for instance. Ricotta, it means recooked. And so you're cooking it. And traditionally, ricotta is where you're taking the whey left over from making some other hard cheese and you heat it, and then you add a little bit of acid, vinegar, or lemon juice, and it helps to develop any of the solids you might have missed. But you don't get much cheese with that method because most of those solids have already gone into your wheel of cheddar or whatever you were making. So most of us will make ricotta in a different way. It's more of a farmhouse cheese, and it's called whole milk ricotta, where we'll just take milk and heat it up. You can heat it to about 185, 190 degrees. Add your acid, whether that's vinegar or lemon juice or citric acid. You'll see the milk curdle. You strain that into some cheesecloth, and voila, you've got cheese. That's really probably the easiest cheese to make. And that's where I usually suggest starting. Now, how much acid you add may depend on your breed or species of animal. So like for goat and cow milk, you're going to add, say, a quarter cup of vinegar for a gallon of milk. For sheep milk, you're probably going to add a lot less than that, because sheep milk is a lot easier to get this separation to happen. And if you add too much of that acid, your cheese isn't as good. It's a little sour and it's a little tough and chewy. So that's the simplest cheese by far, and a good place to start because everybody's got vinegar, or easy access to a lemon, and then milk. And you can do this with grocery store milk. I mean, you don't have to have a dairy animal to do that particular cheese.
It's just the ultra pasteurized, right? That can't
Right,
really
right. So, right, when you go to the grocery store, you'll see pasteurized milk and ultra pasteurized milk. And that ultra pasteurized milk means ultra high temperatures. And they're doing it basically to keep that milk from becoming cheese. It basically extends the shelf life a long, long time. And depending on how high of a temperature they went, you might not even need to refrigerate that milk, which to me says it's not exactly really milk anymore, right?
Yeah.
So you always want to stay away from ultra pasteurized milks for cheese making. Some cheeses are more sensitive to the pasteurization temperature, like mozzarella. You have to really use a low temperature. But many cheeses, especially these direct acidification, high temperature cheeses, it doesn't matter what temperature it was pasteurized at, as long as it wasn't ultra pasteurized. Yeah.
What's the most complicated cheese that you've ever made?
Well, I would say a true cheddar has the making part of it has a lot of steps, because there's a part of making cheddar called cheddaring, and it involves several hours of every 15 minutes. You're flipping these blocks of cheddar curds, and then you have to cut those curds and salt them and put them back together into a wheel of cheese. So that one, during the make time, the time we're working with the curds, has a lot of steps. I wouldn't say it's necessarily hard to do. It just takes some time to do it right. And then there are other cheeses where the make is really simple. So when we make an aged cheese, we divide it into two parts. The make is the day you work with the milk, and then the affinage is the time that you're aging the cheese. And for some cheeses, the affinage is just waiting. You've waxed the wheel of cheese or you vacuum sealed it, and all you're doing is waiting. But for other cheeses, the make is super simple, but the affinage is a little trickier. So think of like Brie and Camembert, or some of those cheeses where you might be developing a washed rind. The make is super simple. I mean, it's just, put some culture in, put some rennet in, scoop it into some forms, and you're done. But the affinage, you have to be tending to it, and you're using a lot more of your intuition to monitor the humidity level, and you're having to flip it and maybe even wash the wheels. And this could be going on for several weeks or several months. And so those cheeses, the making of them is simple, but the aging of them is more complicated.
Yeah. Wow. Um, I have seen people in their like little cheese caves, like turning them, and I think I've even seen some people doing like the washing and stuff. And I like that you made the point that like there's two aspects of it, and sometimes this is harder than the other.
Yes.
At what point do you add any extra flavoring to it, like versus just I'm just making it plain? Um, or I'm adding herbs and salt and seasoning and stuff. So at what
Yeah,
point, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're making.
it
Um,
does.
but can
Yeah.
you talk
So
about that kind of process?
for sure. There's lots of different ways you could flavor cheeses and different times you would. And so we'll talk first about fresh cheeses because that's where most people start. Usually, those cheeses you're going to flavor after you've made the cheese. So think of ricotta or chèvre or fromage blanc. You make the cheese and then you add flavors. Either you're putting some kind of dried herbs or some kind of seeds or some kind of nuts or jam. And you could put it into the curd itself, or you could sprinkle it on top or make a log. One of the nice things about those cheeses is they're super versatile because the cheese has already been made. And now you're going to put that cheese in the regular refrigerator. You're not aging it at cellar temperature, which means you can put anything into it. You could make bacon chev if you want to, because you're going to put it in the refrigerator, or
And these
you're
are
just going to eat
softer
it.
cheeses, right? They're the
Yes,
softer ones that you can kind of just fold the
exactly. Or you can roll them into a log and roll them into something. So those are very simple to flavor in many, many different ways. And you do it after you've made the cheese. With an aged cheese, there are some cheeses where you're actually infusing the milk itself with some type of a flavor.
Mm,
Like there's a type of a mushroom camembert where people actually infuse the milk with some dried mushrooms,
mm,
and that gives the milk itself a flavor. There aren't very many cheeses that I find that you're actually flavoring the milk. Most of the time with those cheeses, you may get to the point where you have curds, but you haven't put those curds into a form yet, a wheel, and you might add a flavor at that point. So again, you could add dried herbs or seeds, those types of cheese, or chilies, like in, chili jack. Those types of cheeses, though, you have to be a little bit careful about what you're adding, because now that cheese is going to age at cellar temperature, 50 to 55 degrees for a period of time. Not everything will age well with it. Like you wouldn't put fresh herbs into a cheese that's going to age. You would just have slime by the time you open the cheese, right? But you could put dried herbs in and that could age. And then there are some cheeses where you've made the whole wheel of cheese and now you're going to flavor that wheel of cheese. For instance, drunken goat cheese, one of my favorites. You make the wheel of cheese and then you get the goats drunk. No, and then you soak the wheel of cheese in wine. And so you've made the wheel, but now you're going to flavor the outside. Or sometimes the way that you're aging it, as in a washed rind cheese, you might be washing it with different things. Traditionally, it's a brine made with Brevibacterium linens, which is this stinky little bacteria that makes that gooey rind. But you could also be washing it with wine, or with wine that has herbs in it, or with beer. So those are also ways to infuse flavor into a cheese. So depending on the cheese, there are different points at which you can add all kinds of flavors.
how do you taste as you go? Like for the aged cheeses, do you just kind of go, this is the recipe I'm using and we'll just have to wait and see if it's good? Or do
Pretty
you
much.
wait? Is that what it is?
Yeah, because it doesn't taste like much when it's in the curd stage. All those curds kind of just taste like milk, because what's happening during the aging time is fermentation. So the flavor is going to change significantly over time. And some cheeses have a shorter time, like a brie or camembert might be 2 to 4 weeks, whereas some cheeses it might be 2 to 4 months, whereas some it might be 2 to 4 years. Right. And it's not that the cheese won't have a flavor sooner. It's just certain cheeses develop their optimal flavor at a certain point. And so it is a little harder with those cheeses because you do have this waiting time. So like in my classes, I teach when people are getting ready to make their first hard cheese. I have a class called Intro to Hard Cheese, where we've picked a very quick aging hard cheese. Because when you're first learning, do you want to have to wait 6 months to know how it turned out? So, this is a cheese that it's pretty good in about 3 weeks. Now it's better in 3 months, but you could taste it in 3 weeks and you'd have a decent cheese to put on a cheese plate. And so that makes it nice because as you're learning, you need to be able to taste in order to know how you succeeded. And so this one has a shorter generation for you to then make improvements the next time. Yeah.
For a wheel, if you were to cut into it and taste it, does that mean you can't or continue aging it?
No, I mean, the big cheese houses, of course, don't want to cut into a big wheel of cheese and to test it. So they use this probe that goes into the cheese and it just takes out a core of the cheese. So it's only damaging a little section of the cheese. And then they'll continue aging it if it's not ready yet. But really for the home cheese maker, you can cut into a cheese and you can taste it. And if it isn't right yet, you can let it keep aging longer. Now you have damaged a portion of that cheese that isn't going to age the same around that place. So you're going to get mold introduced into that little area. Depending on how you're aging the cheese, though, if you're doing it with wax or vacuum sealing, you can re-wax it or re-vacuum seal it after you've tasted it. But if it's something like, say, a camembert, where you've now damaged that section, that little area of the cheese isn't going to continue aging quite the same way, but the rest of the wheel will. And so I think a lot of times people think everything will just stop the minute you cut the cheese, and it doesn't work that way. Because, the chemistry is still, all the parts are still in that cheese, and it's going to continue developing. And it's kind of amazing. Some cheeses, you might taste it at 2 months and be like, this is awful. And I just say, put it back in the cheese cave and wait 2 or 3 more months. And then you open it up and you're like, oh my gosh, it's so delicious. It's a completely different cheese now.
Yeah, and that's why they leave it in there for as long as they do. It's kind of like wine, it'll get to the right flavor. You just, have to be patient, which some people are very patient, some people aren't.
Yes.
So I think that also
and also some cheeses, it's not necessarily that they're better, they're just different. So what you want, like I just taught a class yesterday, Montasio, and that cheese is sold at different aging times. There's a fresco version that's sold at 2 to 3 months. There's a Mezzano that's sold at 4 to 10 months. And there's one that's sold way after, 18 months or longer. And all of those are good, but they're different. And so sometimes there's not necessarily an optimal time. It's what do you like? And that's when it's the optimal time.
Can we talk a little bit about rennet? Because I think you talked about cultures, but we didn't get into the whole idea of rennet, what it is, and like what cheeses would you, they don't all use rennet,
right? Right. So those direct acidification cheeses don't use any culture or rennet most of the time. There are some cheeses that use a direct acidification and rennet, like there's a quick mozzarella that uses citric acid instead of culture to get it to happen quicker, but then it also adds rennet. But most cheeses and most of your hard and aged cheeses are essentially going to have 4 ingredients: milk, culture, rennet, and salt. And you might add different amounts of those ingredients or even different strains of culture, and then you do different things in different amounts of time. The rennet, though, is the coagulant. So the culture is the acidifier and a lot of the flavor developer, but the rennet is going to be what actually brings all those solids together and makes a curd. And so rennet is an enzyme. And traditionally in cheese making, it's animal rennet. And this is an enzyme that's found in the lining of a baby animal's stomach, typically a ruminant stomach, goat, cow, or sheep. Most of our animal rennet is cow rennet because, of course, we have way more cows and people eat veal. And so you've already slaughtered the little baby calf and it's easy to harvest that enzyme. So that enzyme coagulates your cheese because it did that for the baby, right? All the baby was getting when it was a baby was its mother's milk. and that milk would go through that baby so quickly, baby couldn't absorb all the nutrients. So
Mhm.
this enzyme is in that baby's tummy in order to make cheese. So that it takes longer to digest. And that as that baby stops drinking milk and starts taking in solids, that enzyme gradually disappears. And that's why we need a baby animal, typically a ruminant. It's in the fourth chamber of a ruminant stomach. Now, for some people who are vegetarians but do still eat cheese, they're not so happy about this animal rennet story. And so there are vegetarian rennets. These are usually either a microbial enzyme, or they are made from the introduction of a little bit of rennet, the animal rennet, but then cultivated in a lab. There's also some that are made with vegetables or plants like thistle rennet. There's fig sap rennet. I've never made that and never had a cheese with fig sap rennet, but I've heard you can make rennet. So there are different forms of rennet that will coagulate cheese, and you sometimes work with them a little bit differently, but many cheese making supply houses will carry an animal or a vegetable version of rennet. What you don't want to use for most cheeses is junket rennet. And that's a rennet you can sometimes find at a grocery store. And it's a different set of enzymes than most cheeses use. We're using an enzyme called chymosin. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but that's how it's spelled, as opposed to pepsin, which is, I think, what's in junket rennet. There are some junket rennet cheeses, but I've never made them, and I've heard they're not very good. So so you do want to make sure you're getting cheese making rennet.
Is the vegetable rennet versus the animal rennet, could you taste the difference in the cheeses, or is it pretty even?
I would say, first of all, it depends on the cheese. So a fresher cheese that has rennet in it, you probably won't taste much of a difference. Whereas with an aged cheese, as that flavor development changes, some people can detect a little bit. They usually describe it as a little bitter or a little mushroomy. But
Mm.
I would say that also depends on how sensitive your palate is. They say some people can taste the terroir in their wine, and others, yeah, wine is wine. So I would say it depends a little bit on your sensitivity. And
Mhm.
then also, even if you can taste it, is it unpleasant or not, might depend on your palate too.
Mhm. Let's move on to the tools, because I just saw your video the other day about the molds and the presses and stuff,
Uh-huh.
which I was just fascinated by. So let's talk a little bit about, kind of what tools you use. You don't have to go into too in depth of like what I use it specifically
Yeah,
for, because I
yeah.
know that can get really complicated. But just kind of some of the things that maybe if someone starting out could use, and then maybe the like advanced tools.
Yeah, and I think for most people, at least I know for me and a lot of my students, there's this mystery around cheese making that we think it's going to be a lot more difficult than it actually is. And we think that we're going to need a lot more specialized equipment than we actually do. So again, those fresh cheeses just require a lot less stuff. And most of it you probably already have in your kitchen. So, you're going to need some kind of a pot. I like stainless steel just because it's non-reactive and it's easy to clean and it's relatively inexpensive. But anything that's not aluminum, we don't want to use aluminum because that is a reactive metal.
Mm.
So any kind of pot, basically. And then we're going to need things like a measuring cup and measuring spoons and some kind of a serrated spoon. I like to use the big skimmer spoons that are wide because they make my job quicker and easier, but anything would do. Probably the two things that you would need that you might not have when you're first starting out as a fresh cheese maker is some kind of cheesecloth that's really for fresh, soft curd cheese, as opposed to that really big woven cheesecloth you might see in your grocery store. Cheesecloth that's actually used for cheese making is much finer woven. And in fact, they have a type called butter muslin, which is even finer weave. And that really works better for capturing all of the solids and not losing any of the good cheese when you're draining it. And then the other thing, and that's really inexpensive. I mean, you can find it online at a lot of cheese making houses. Very inexpensive and reusable. So don't think you're going to just throw that away. You're just going to wash it out, rinse it with cold water, and then either boil it or put it in your washing machine. I like to put it on the top shelf of my dishwasher, run it through the whole wash, rinse, dry, sanitize function. So you can reuse it for years and years. So it's a very small investment. And then the other thing that sometimes people need is a cheese making thermometer, because cheese making, the range of temperatures is much lower than, say, meat or candy making. Any digital thermometer obviously would work. I actually like to use frothing thermometers, cappuccino type of thermometers, because they have a little clip and they'll slip on the side of your pot. Again, very inexpensive. You can pick those up for under $10. So truly, you can probably invest in less than $20 and you can have your culture and your rennet and your butter muslin and a thermometer. It's a very inexpensive hobby to start with. Milk will be your most expensive thing if you don't have access to good fresh milk. And then when you're getting into the aged cheeses, you do need to have some kind of form, right? Something to make that wheel of cheese. And that could vary from a very simple little basket form, which might only cost $1 or $2, to a more complex form. I mean, I have one mold or form that I spent $80 on. I'd say, again, you're probably looking at $15 or $20 for a nice hard cheese form that you can make many kinds of cheese out of. And then you will need some kind of a press if you're making a pressed cheese. Not all aged cheeses are pressed, but like camembert isn't pressed. You just need a form. But if you're making a hard cheese, you need a press. You can easily make a press. You do not have to buy a fancy press. In fact, on my website at theartofcheese.com, if you put in bucket press, you will see a very simple instructions how to make a cheese press out of 3 buckets. And they should be food grade buckets, but you can usually get those free at a deli or a bakery just by asking, or you can order them online for a few bucks. And you can easily make a press out of a bucket with just water as your weight. Super simple. And then if you're going to age your cheese properly, you do need a cheese cave. Now, don't think you need to build a cave in your backyard. Just get an old dorm refrigerator and turn it to its warmest setting, and probably that's going to work for you. It's about 50 to 55 degrees. So it's not a huge investment of time and equipment. You can get fancier and fancier, but that's all you really need, and you can make just about every type of cheese with those pieces of equipment.
And I would think cost would also affect how big you're getting all these things. Because I'm
For
sure
sure.
they come in a variety of sizes, so that will affect cost as well, whether you're trying to do little tiny ones or if you're like,
Exactly.
most home people aren't going to have the huge ones, but
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say most home cheese makers are working with up to 5 gallons of milk at a time. I rarely make a batch of cheese that's more than 3 gallons. So I do need a fairly big pot, and I would need a form that would hold that, but not a huge difference in price. When you're getting into really big things, then yeah, the pricing, and then where you're going to put all that, a dorm refrigerator is not going to hold a 200-pound wheel of cheese.
yeah,
But it'll hold 1 to 5 gallon pounds. Okay.
I've seen people like turning their like either basement or maybe just an extra room they have in the house, like a guest room, into like a full-on cheese cave, which
Yeah.
that's, if that's the hobby or that's what you're going into, then absolutely that's an option.
Yes, I have threatened to turn my my daughter's old bedroom into a cheese cave because it's in the back corner of our house. And if we closed the door and just turned our heat down a little bit, it would almost be cellar temperature. So far, I haven't won yet. I don't have a full-size bedroom that's my cheese cave. I do have 3 little aging caves. I actually converted a full-size refrigerator, because that's another thing you can do, is just buy a full-size used refrigerator, and then you can buy something called a temperature controller. And that's a probe that will just to turn the refrigerator on and off so that you can reach that optimal temperature. And it's really inexpensive. You can get those for 50 or 75 bucks. And then you have a full-size fridge to age all your cheeses in.
Yeah. Well, and that's awesome too. Like, just to keep that as an option. I know when like and my family, they, bought a new fridge, and instead of, just chucking the old one, if that's what
Mhm.
you are doing, you're making cheese, and just keep the old one, as long as it still works.
Yeah,
Um,
and the thing is, it doesn't
and
even
keep
have to
my
work all that well, right? Because a lot of times what's happening with those fridges as they get older is they're not maybe cooling as much, but we don't want it that cold.
mm,
And so going to a thrift store, a Goodwill, and buying an old refrigerator, you can sometimes get those for 25 or $50, and you might not even need a temperature controller because it might be that the problem with it is it doesn't keep it cold enough, and it might be just perfect for a cheese cave.
yeah, and keep in mind for if you have like family members or friends who are getting a new fridge and they don't know what they're doing with the old one. We ended up getting a freezer chest for our potential meat, from people who were like, "Oh, we just have an extra one that we don't want anymore. Do you
Yeah.
guys want it for free?" And we're like, "Sure."
Yeah, a lot
So
of places, you get a new fridge and then you're paying them to haul away your old refrigerator.
mhm,
And so if you had somebody that would be willing to come and take it for free, it actually would save you money. So yeah,
yeah,
it doesn't have to be as daunting as I think some people, think that it will be, like this huge investment. You can get fancy. Like I do know people that go all in with it, but you don't have to. I do it all my classes. My whole goal is cut out any unnecessary steps, any unnecessary time, and any unnecessary equipment. Because I really want people to just make cheese and enjoy it and have easy access to it.
yeah. And I would say from my point of view, I am not a science-minded person, so the whole idea of like the science aspect of cheese making is sometimes a little daunting and a little bit like, oh no, I can't. Same with the
Yes.
soap making. Like there's just certain parts of it where I'm like, there's just a lot of like pH. As soon as you hear like the scientific terms, like
Yes.
my brain just goes, no.
Oh,
But
I
like,
know.
but I think it's once you get into it and you talk about like, you don't need to know all the
Right.
technical terms. You just need to know you need to do this specific action. And,
Exactly.
unless you're teaching it, you don't need to know why this happens, like the chemical.
Exactly. And later down the road, as you're trying to fine tune things, you might want to know a little bit more. But I often tell people I named my business The Art of Cheese, not The Science of Cheese. And that's because I didn't like science either. I was a terrible chemistry student. And, I was a psychology major, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
So I really didn't start out even understanding a lot of the science until I really got into it. And I would say, yeah, it's fun to learn science in that context because it's more interesting when it's something you can eat. But a lot of, the nice thing about using these cultures and these rennets and things is they're really standardized so that it's more of a time and temperature thing than I don't even use a pH meter in most of my personal cheese making.
Mhm.
We have a class on using pH meters and how to read pH and the importance of it. But I feel like that's daunting to a lot of home cheese makers. And it's not actually necessary for you to totally know or even do to make pretty darn good cheese. It's
Mhm.
more when you're trying to, there's a few complex cheeses that it might help the process if you have that. And if you're trying to fine tune something and you're trying to get just exactly to certain flavor or texture, you might want to know that. But most of the time it's not actually necessary for you to do. So again, I agree. Like I feel like soap making is a similar thing. I had to watch somebody else make soap 3 times before I got brave enough to do it myself. And then once I did it, I'm like, oh, it's not that scary and it's not that complex. And you only really have to understand time and what you're looking for. I teach a lot based on feel and look than on what is actually happening behind the scenes. It helps if you understand it so you can tweak it. But a lot of times there's way more intuition and art that goes into those two processes than the science, anyhow. The science only takes you so far. Then you have
Yeah.
to respond to what you're seeing.
And I feel like a lot of the terms and stuff you pick up, like if this is something that you really love to do, that you don't necessarily need to know it right away. But if
For
you have
sure.
something that you love and it's your hobby, then it's stuff that you're going to hear other cheesemakers talking about, and you're going to pick up on that stuff.
Oh,
Um, you don't
exactly.
need
I
to know
hear,
all 100 terms at
no,
at
no,
day
no.
one.
I know. And, I say that's the same with so many things. We've been talking a lot about goat keeping and sheep keeping, and it's kind of similar. At the beginning, you need to know a certain amount of stuff, right? You need to know what breed you want. Maybe you got to experiment a little to figure that out. Have to have some housing and some feed requirements, but you're going to learn more of what you need as you need it.
Mhm.
Even, when you have your own babies, right? You need to know how to care for an infant when you don't need to know how to care for a teenager until they're a teenager. So I feel like it's similar, with cheese making. You don't need to know everything to get started. You'll learn what you need to know as you need to know it.
It's very much like, you're never ready for a baby until it comes. And even then, you're not always ready. I
Yes.
think for like soap and cheese, it's very much of that. Just try it, like
Yeah, you
just
got to do it.
do it. And that's where you're going to learn the most by just doing. You can research up until, all
Exactly.
day long, but until you have your hands on, you're smelling, you're seeing, and you're feeling all these things, you're never going to actually, it's not going to click, I think, until
Exactly.
you're
And,
doing it.
just like in life in general, we make mistakes all the time. And it's learning from those mistakes that's important. And that's exactly how cheese is, and even soap. You're going to make some mistakes along the way. The good thing with cheese is most of your mistakes are still edible. They just aren't quite the cheese you set out to make.
Mhm.
But they're most of the time going to still be delicious, and other people might not even know you made a mistake. Or you might make a mistake and you just invented a new cheese. And then you're like, oh, I'm going to do that every time now. So
Mhm.
I think when people get past that hurdle too, it's a great exercise for perfectionists, because it teaches you to kind of let go of that and embrace your mistakes, because sometimes they're really delicious and you almost always will learn something. And so I really try to take that intimidation piece out of it for people.
Mhm. Yeah, I am a perfectionist, and I'm finding farming and just everything that has to
It's
do with it.
teaching you
It
to loosen up,
it
girlfriend,
teaches
right?
me to just like take it in stride and just, swallow your pride, swallow that perfectionism, and just learn from it and move on.
Yeah,
Um,
and know that all of us, like, I'm talking all this fancy terminology. I didn't know all that when I started making cheese at all. And
mhm.
yet I still started making cheese,
And I
and
feel like
so
you know more of the technical terms because you're teaching it. My
for
mom,
sure.
I was homeschooled, and my mom was like, you know what? I know a whole lot more after having taught it than
Right.
even just going through the class itself. It's like because you have to
Exactly.
absorb it and really know it before you're able to teach it.
Yeah.
Um, and so like that's another thing that, if you are to a certain point where you are pretty good at it, try teaching somebody, because that'll definitely kind of show you where your holes are, and just maybe the vocabulary or the steps, so you're going to have somebody go and ask you a question that you're not going to know. And
Yes.
that's where you go, oh, okay, so I'm going to
For
go and
sure.
find that.
Yes, and that happens to me all the time. I get students, because one of the things we do differently, although we are teaching virtually now because we have to, we're not just like a YouTube video, because I mean we do put our classes on YouTube, so you get the recording after the live session, or you can buy it as a recording. But then you still have access to us to ask, I have a couple of other instructors as well, and you can ask us questions. And sometimes your questions, I don't necessarily know the answer to. And that's one way I've learned so much over the years, is having to answer all those questions and then researching it and having to get back to people with a good answer.
Hmm.
So it is definitely a process, and so that's why I say, starting with those fresher, easier cheeses, there's just fewer questions, and less time that you have to wait to see what the results are. But
Hmm.
don't be intimidated by any of them. Almost every cheese you've ever tasted is doable on the home scale.
Hmm. So one of the things we talked about, because you mentioned whey, is that something that you can do something with, or is it just down the drain?
Oh no, you can do all kinds of good stuff with whey. So, whey is still loaded with nutrients, because not all of the protein goes into the cheese. About 20% of it stays with the whey. So there's a lot of protein still in the whey. There's all kinds of good enzymes. It is a little higher in lactose. So for people who are lactose intolerant, the whey may be problematic, but you can still do things with it, even if you're not going to eat it. So some of my favorite things to do with whey, I really like to bake bread with whey.
Mm.
So I'll just substitute almost any bread recipe. You can just substitute whatever the liquid in that bread is for whey. I do find it makes a little denser bread, so I'll often increase the yeast amount if I'm going to use whey. But I have some recipes for super simple whey bread that doesn't take a lot of time at all. So I make all my bread homemade now because it's so easy and I always have whey. I also like to save liquid whey and put it in smoothies. So you can do that either just liquid whey that you're storing in the refrigerator, or you could freeze that whey in ice cube trays and then pop those cubes into your smoothies. And it's a great way. It doesn't probably add a ton of flavor. It just adds nutrients to your smoothies. You could also cook with the whey in some other ways. It's a very punny word. Like you can put it in soup stocks or in sauces and then just get some nutrients that way. I actually marinated, I brined my Thanksgiving turkey this year in a combination of a salted apple cider and whey. And it made probably one of the juiciest turkeys we'd had for a long time because it is acidic. So it's helping to break down. It's kind of like the equivalent of putting wine or lemon juice into something. And then you can also do some things with whey that aren't ingested, like if you have a compost pile, putting whey on the compost pile because of the acidity, it will help it break down faster. There's also some plants that really like whey, plants like tomato plants and blueberries and hyacinths. These are all plants that like an acidic environment. And so adding whey as part of their watering regimen will make them grow better or make prettier colors on your hyacinths. So, and then, if you just have too much whey, you can always pour it down the drain. It's not the end of the world. I have so much whey, I can't really use it all. Oh, another thing is livestock. A lot of people that have dairy and make cheese have hogs because they love whey. It's a great nutrient for them. And then chickens also really like whey. They like curds too. So any of your cheese that you're not happy with, you just give it to the chickens and they'll be happy to eat it for you.
Well, and I would think that like with neighbors or friends or family who don't have or aren't making cheeses, if you want to offer that to them, I'm sure that they, I know a bunch of family members who would like, oh yeah, I'd love to try that.
Yeah.
Especially when you said the turkey thing, I was like, oh, that
Mhm.
sounds really good.
Yeah, yeah. And also like I don't raise hogs, but I have friends that do. So often they'll come and get buckets of whey for their hogs. So and then I even know of one, there's a creamery here in Colorado that actually spreads the whey on their pastures as a fertilizer where their goats are then going to be grazing. And I love that because it goes kind of full cycle, right? The
Circle of life.
goats start and they make the cheese and then the whey goes back to the goats. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's nice to know that the whey itself is so nutrient dense that
Hmm.
it's definitely something where if you can find a way to use it, use it.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people would just think to just throw it down the drain because oh, that's not part of the cheese, so just it,
Yeah.
you don't need it. Um, so I love that. Do you want to share what your favorite cheeses are? Like maybe top two or three, and maybe like what your favorite flavors. Like what do you like to put in your cheeses that you're just like, yeah, this is my favorite.
Yeah. Well, so I always answer that question like it kind of depends on the circumstances. So, my favorite cheese to make if I don't have time to make cheese. So, that is definitely Chev, which is, the soft goat cheese. You could make that with any milk and you just wouldn't call it Chev since Chev means goat. Fromage Blanc is roughly the same cheese and it just means white cheese. So, you could make that with any milk. I love that cheese because it's so easy. You do very little, you wait. It's about a 24 to 48 hour cheese, but most of the time you're just waiting. So it's a simple cheese when you just don't have time to make cheese. And then I love to flavor that cheese all kinds of ways, but probably my favorite flavor is honey. We raise bees also. So we have our own goat milk and we have our own honey. And honey chev is just one of my favorite cheeses. I just mix the honey right into the chev, and it's both kind of tangy and sweet at the same time. Oh, so delicious.
Well,
So
honey
that's
itself
my,
has a variety of different, like depending on where the honey comes from, has a variety
oh,
of different flavors as well.
So true. And even like our early season honey tastes totally different than our late season honey because of what's in bloom.
Mhm.
Here, our alfalfa honey at the very end of the season has a much darker color and it's just got a different flavor. So that's really fun. But you could also flavor Chev in a savory way, right? You could do it. I always make the joke of bacon chev, which I have never made, but I say it so often, I think I should. But you could put anything in chev and you can flavor it. Literally, I've seen hundreds of flavors for chev. And then probably one of my favorite cheeses to eat. I love a really good aged cheddar. And so I make a special version of cheddar I call tricolor cheddar. Since I have friends with cows, I will do a blend of goat and cow, but I'll actually make 3 different pots of curds and do it simultaneously. So I'll have one that's just all goat milk and I leave that white. And so those curds are very white. And then I'll have one that's just good fresh cow milk that's kind of golden in color. And then I'll have one that's cow milk where I add annatto, which is the colorant that makes cheddar orange. So
Mm.
I'll have this kind of white curds and yellow curds and orange curds. And because with a true cheddar, you make the curds separately and then you force them together with a lot of weight into a wheel, they stay separate in the wheel. So it sort of looks like a candy corn or candy corn colored camo. It's really dramatic and beautiful, but that cheese, it's best. You can eat those curds fresh the day you make them, and those are just fresh cheddar curds, or you can age it for a really long time. And if I age it for a year, I find it's like the best, my favorite cheese. But there's lots of cheeses in between there that are really, Camembert probably also should be in there. That's probably a middle of the road. That's, the bloomy rind cheeses like Brie and Camembert. And I make a lot of different versions of those. And they can be a little tricky when you're first learning them because they're very sensitive to humidity during that first week or 2 of aging. But once you figure that out, they're pretty predictable and they're fast. And they're huge flavors, way bigger flavors than anything you would buy because we don't use any stabilizers or anything when we're making them homemade. And so they're so good. I mean, just creamy and really good. And they're much shorter. You can have a good one, a small wheel in 2 weeks. So you're not having to wait all this time to get to eat it, 4 weeks for a bigger wheel. So
Yeah.
those are probably my 3 favorites is the bloomies, the chev, and the cheddars. And those are a range of times and difficulties.
Do you prefer to just eat the cheese plain, or do you prefer to put it in or make it a part of a meal?
Yeah, it
Or
depends
it
on the
doesn't matter?
cheese. Yeah, I'd say it depends on the cheese. I mean, some cheeses are just best on a cracker, and then others may be on toasted bread, and then others are standalones by themselves. I also love, I've just been getting into recently making cheese boards. One of my instructors is a cheesemonger by training, and those are the ones that would put together all those beautiful cheese boards.
Mm.
So she did a class on cheese boards for us, and I learned so much. I mean, I used to just throw cheese and grapes and crackers on a board, but she taught us all these ways to combine different flavors and textures and patterns and make just a beautiful festive board. And now I'm kind of addicted to doing that. So we have a lot of full meals because it's just my husband and I home right now. We can't really entertain a lot, although I make cheese boards and deliver them to my adult daughters who live around here. Anybody want cheese? Because I've got a lot of cheese right now. But that's really fun too. You can just make a whole meal of it. Add some meat, add some, dried fruit and some nuts and some fresh fruit and maybe some peppers, and you've got a full meal.
I love her title, cheesemonger.
Cheesemonger. Yes, yes.
I'm like, what an amazing title
I
for a
know,
job.
right? Yep, yep.
So another thing I wanted to talk about was getting into a little bit of what else can you do with the goats and the sheep's milk? Because there's so much that you mentioned caramel. Um,
Yes.
Something I've been looking into that I haven't tried yet, but it sounds so easy is butterscotch. Um,
Oh, I haven't done butterscotch.
so they said the difference between caramel and butterscotch is caramel is made with white sugar, butterscotch is made with brown sugar.
Oh, that's interesting
And
because my caramel has both. So
okay,
my caramels, I use butter and brown sugar, white sugar, and honey.
So yours is
So
probably a combo of both.
yeah, and that kind of makes sense because I would say mine does have like a little bit of a butterscotchiness to it, and you can get different textures based on how hot you get it.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's interesting. I should try it sometime without adding the white sugar and see if it tastes different.
Yeah. The place we got our dairy sheep from, it's called Day Springs Dairy in Alabama, and they do their own caramels, variety of different flavors, which are amazing, from
Yeah,
coffee to vanilla to I think they have a bourbon
whiskey.
one with,
Yeah, we do
yeah,
a
something
bit.
with
Yeah.
whiskey or bourbon.
Hmm.
Um, and they do their soft cheeses too. Uh, and it's just one of those things where I never considered a different milk to use for these items. So what,
Yeah.
and people say yogurt, stuff like that. So what kind of things have you made in addition to cheese from your goat's milk? Or
Yeah.
have you
So
heard other people in your area do?
yeah, well, we do make a lot of yogurt, of course, a lot of cheese. We haven't made goat butter yet, only because we don't have a mechanical cream separator. I do make cow butter, and then we make a lot of goat milk ice cream, which is delicious. Sheep milk ice cream and gelato are even better because of the high butter fat content. We do have to add some cream in order to get it that creamy substance. And then there's some other little things, like I just taught this Montazio class, and there's something called frico, which is a fried cheese like chip,
Mm.
where you basically are just grating the cheese and then frying it and then
Oh,
letting that cool, and it becomes like crispy, like kind of like a cracker, but it's all cheese. That's really fun.
wow.
Um, yeah, and so pretty much anything you could think that you might do with milk, you can definitely do with goat or sheep milk, or any milk can become any of those products. And then we do a lot of skincare products too. So I do goat milk soaps primarily. I like the cold processed soap, but I also do melt and pour soap. I've done some hot processed soap. We do some lotions. I've done bath bombs. I've actually done it with liquid milk, which is a little tricky because it kind of wants to start fizzing before before you're ready for it to, but you can do it. I've just started making goat milk candles. So
Mm,
that's kind of neat because the milk actually kind of binds to the wax and makes it a little creamier.
mm.
Um, and so I've just started that. I've heard of some other things that I haven't tried yet. One that's on my to-do list is goat milk paint.
Oh,
Believe it or not, there's somebody in New England making goat milk paint professionally for sale. But
huh.
I have some homemade recipes for goat milk paint, and I just haven't tried it yet. But I'm kind of eager to give that a try as well.
Yeah, a few things that I've heard, that I've seen people try, and this is one that interests me because I can't do milk chocolate because it's usually cow milk,
Mhm.
but you can evaporate your milk so it gets dry. You kind of blend it into a powder, and then you add that to chocolate, and that makes milk chocolate. I mean, okay,
Oh,
I've seen them do the powdered milk. I haven't actually seen anybody do it with chocolate. But I love chocolate, and dark chocolate is just, in some things it's okay, but it's just a little too bitter for me just to just eat on the fly. Um,
yeah.
and so when I was looking in, I just assumed because it was milk chocolate that you just added milk to making it. And what from all the research I read, they're like, no, you don't actually just add straight milk. It's actually like powdered milk that you add. And there's probably chocolatiers that can go straight from the milk maybe, but I think for the most part they're like it's powdered. Um, and I was like, oh, I wonder if you could do that with sheep's milk. I mean, it's
Yeah, I've never tried to dehydrate milk. My understanding is that really you need a pretty fancy piece of equipment to make powdered whey, whey powder.
Mhm.
I have heard of a few people though doing it, and I don't know anything about how to do it, how to get it
Yeah.
to dry before it would ferment, right? Before it would
Mhm.
curdle. So I don't have any experience with that, but if you figure it out, you'll have to let me know.
I'll have to ask the person. It was on a sheep milk Facebook group. I think it's called like Dairy Homesteaders. But a sheep dairy homestead or sheep dairy, I don't know. It's one of those. If I find it, I'll put a link in the description. Um, but it was a guy who had a dehydrator and he'd use it for fruit as well, but he
Mhm.
just put a layer of the milk. And I don't know if he froze it ahead of time and then
Mm.
did it, because I mean that would potentially keep it from curdling. But he was able to manage to do it and then get it into a powder. So I was like,
Mm.
it's I mean, technically, if you can do it with cow's milk, I mean, aside from the homogenized aspect, it should technically be able to be done with goat and sheep. It's just, you know, uh, how hard do you have to work to get there?
Yeah. Well, we do make something we call chev truffles, and you could try that with your sheep milk too. If you can do dark chocolate.
Mm,
So it's basically you're taking your chev, or in your case, you might call it fromage blanc or something that's like that with sheep milk. And then you're basically adding melted chocolate, which you
mm,
could add anything from milk chocolate to a really dark chocolate. And the darker it is, you may add a little bit more sugar. We usually use powdered sugar because it makes it a little creamier.
mm,
And then you're basically blending that all together and forming a little ball of chocolate cheese. And so it's really creamy and just delicious. You chill them and they're just really great. You can also then roll those in something like more dark chocolate, or
nuts.
powdered cocoa, and powdered sugar or nuts or coconut or something like that to make a little
Mhm.
truffle.
I never thought to do chocolate and cheese,
Oh yeah,
like
I used to,
together.
at every class, we used to always end every class with chocolate cheese. So I would Google all these different cheese and chocolate combinations. I actually learned how to make some kind of a blue cheese chocolate truffle, which I know sounds gross, but it was delicious. Chocolate covered brie bites. You take
Mhm.
little pieces of brie and freeze them and then dunk them in chocolate, and then it turns into like a little piece of candy. Chocolate ricotta mousse is really great, and these chocolate chef truffles. Yeah, I like chocolate almost as much as I like cheese. So I figured out many ways to blend the two. I
I
always have
can,
chocolate on my cheese boards too.
yeah, I was like, that's definitely gonna be on the list. When you do the chocolate, is it a cocoa powder or do you melt bars of chocolate?
I have different recipes that will do both. So, like
Okay.
chocolate ricotta mousse, I typically do with melted chocolate chips. And then I have two different recipes for chev truffles. One, it's more, I call it chocolate truffle chev because it's more like a chocolate cheese.
Mm,
It's like a chocolate cheesecake, and that would use powdered cocoa. And then we have one that we more call chocolate chev truffles. And
mm,
that one we're actually melting chocolate and putting it into the cheese. And so it's making it more like a piece of candy than just a
mhm.
piece of cheese.
When I would say that for someone, because I know truffle is kind of one of those flavors that are kind of, you either love it or you don't.
Well, you're thinking of truffles like the mushrooms. So there's different truffles, right? There's
Well, and I was
truffle.
thinking like when you
Yeah.
combine it with other ingredients, then it would affect the taste as well.
Yes. Yes.
So don't just write it off as, oh, it's a truffle. I'm not gonna try that.
Yeah,
Um,
well, chocolate chev truffles don't have that truffle flavor you're
mm,
talking about. That's a mushroom flavor called a truffle, which
mm,
a lot of times people we get those two things mixed up. Truffle mushrooms are also used in cheese a lot, and I agree.
okay.
It's a flavor that you can overdo. A little bit goes a long way, and I agree. Some people like it. I'm actually not a huge mushroom truffle gal. I like just a little bit. I mean, I know some people that just love it and would put it on everything
So you're talking about a truffle as the dessert.
as a piece of candy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
Okay.
more like a shape than a flavor, right? A
Okay.
truffle would be a little piece of chocolate candy that's in a
Mhm,
certain shape. And sometimes those truffles, and in fact, we've done that where, it's often a truffle has an outer shell of candy with something creamy in the middle. And
mm,
that creamy thing could be like honey chev, for instance,
mhm,
inside that creamy shell, or it could be the chocolate truffle flavored chev that
mm.
then you put into a chocolate shell. Or you could just have the chocolate cheese
Do you
and
do
forget about the
jams or
shell.
jellies in the center too, like sweet
Yeah,
stuff?
you could do that too. All kinds of stuff.
What's great about just cooking in general, but especially like the cheese and just baking, is that there's just so many things you can do with all of these. Um,
Yes.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the ice cream because that's what we're planning to do in the long run, is to kind of have a ice cream, sheep's milk ice cream business.
Hmm.
Um, and I know just from my research that for the most part, you can basically take any recipe and just replace it with sheep's milk. Like you said, goats, maybe you need to add a little bit more cream. But because ice cream itself already is really creamy, or sorry, sheep's milk is
Right.
already really creamy, that it doesn't always necessarily need anything added to it. You can just replace whatever milk or a heavy cream or whatever you're using for your ice cream with the sheep's milk.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so for you, what have your experiences been with the goat's milk? I know a lot of people would be like, well, what does it taste like? You know,
Yeah, well, and that's a good question about goat milk, especially. And I imagine this is true in sheep milk too. But with goats, a lot of the flavor difference depends on the breed of the goats. And it then also can depend on what you're feeding the goats. And it also can depend on what time of year it is. So, where are they hormonally? And it can also depend on where are those stinky bucks. If the stinky bucks are living with the does, your milk's kind of stinky. But if they're separate, your milk won't be stinky. So I would say, for me, because I raise Nubian goats, Nubians and Nigerian dwarfs are known for probably the highest butter fat content and the sweetest flavor of milk, Nigerians being definitely the highest. So I think Nigerian dwarfs, water buffalo, and sheep are the highest butter fat milks. Nubian milk is on par, pretty close to Jersey cow milk,
mm,
whereas like Saanen and Alpine milk is much lower in butter fat. And then the flavors are a little bit different depending on the breed too. So, and this is somewhat of a generalization because even within a particular breed, different individual animals might have different flavors and different butter fat contents to their
mm,
milk. So, because I raise Nubians, most people really can't taste the difference. It doesn't taste goaty. And so, it is fairly high butter fat, but not high enough to replace all the cream. I have made it, the difference between like ice milk and ice cream.
mhm,
So, if I make it with just 100% goat milk and no added cream, it's a little bit more icy. So it's a little more that texture of ice milk.
mm.
Whereas if I add like heavy cream or whipping cream, about half and half, then it has much more creaminess. But like you said, with sheep milk, and I don't know how much individual breeds vary in butter fat, but you're usually in a much higher butter fat category, and you probably don't need to add much butter fat. So really, I just make a really simple ice cream that's milk and whipping cream and sugar and vanilla extract, and then put all that into an ice cream maker and you're good to go.
Yeah, and I know from our, at least from the ice cream perspective, there's a difference between ice cream and gelato, and
Hmm.
the amount of fat percentage is what
Hmm.
it becomes. So if you have a sheep or a goat that has less fat, then it's gelato. If you breed specifically because you want ice cream, you need to have the milk itself, the content has to be higher in the fat, and that's how you get it. So it's one of those things where a lot of people I've talked to who want to do sheep's milk ice cream, like even for us, depending on what ours produces, it might be we do gelato more than
Hmm.
ice cream just because of the fat content. It could be just slightly under, but
Yeah.
you still technically have to call it one versus the
Hmm.
other depending on the percentage.
Yeah, I have a student up in Wisconsin that has sheep and she makes gelato.
Hmm. Yeah, because I was like, what's the difference? Why? Because I always thought, well, ice cream just sounds more personable, where gelato sounds really fancy and, Italian. And I was like, that just doesn't sound like, so I thought it was a different process of it. It was like, no, it's really just the fat content. So we might end up doing gelato more than ice cream just because of what our sheep produce. So I always
Hmm.
thought that was an interesting aspect to the ice cream part of it.
Yeah, well, and you could probably still do all sheep milk by if you got a mechanical cream separator, or if you were able to separate some of the cream, you could probably add back in cream to some of your mix and get that
Hmm.
butterfat content up, and then use that lower butterfat milk for making some cheeses that might actually just turn out better with a little less butterfat.
Hmm.
Some of the harder cheeses, especially some of the alpine cheeses, if you have too much butter fat, they just are a little greasy. And so
Mm-hmm.
you might actually find that you could do it that way and be able to get 100% sheep milk, even with your breed of sheep,
Mm-hmm.
into
And
that ice cream
it,
category.
I think the same guy that did the evaporated milk, what he does is he puts his milk in the fridge and separates it as much as it can. We'll
Hmm.
pull out the cream and make butter, and whatever's left, I believe he makes mozzarella. Um, so he shows kind of how to make it and stuff like that, and how like you can use the same amount of milk and make two different products, which
Right.
I love the idea of like how much can I get out of this
Yeah. Yeah,
this 1
exactly.
gallon or whatever you end up with. Um, and so I think we're a little over the time, and I want to make sure that you have your weekend. um, so thank you so much for joining me. Please share your website, your social media. I know that I'm like saving up money to join one of your classes once we have milk, because I was like, I just want to learn about all of this. So share with our audience so that they can find you and follow you.
Sure. So my website is theartofcheese.com. So, and that's where you'll really find links to everything else on the website, including how to contact me and all of our classes. So we do offer, like I said, we are doing live but virtual classes, and those are scheduled at a certain time, and you can interact with us right during the class. And then we also offer those same classes on demand, which are recordings, and you can then ask questions after the fact by just emailing us. We also have a cheese making club that gives you discounts and also gives you some free classes every month and gives you a little bit more mentoring support. We do private consultations as well. And we have some weekly cheese Zoom sessions that are question and answer sessions. So that's the best way to find me, find everything. But I am on Facebook and Instagram. I also am on Twitter and LinkedIn. And I have a YouTube channel as well. So all of those you can access through that site. And then I do, so most of my classes are for pay, because that's how we make our living. But I do, and that's what you were referring to, every Friday, I do a free session on social media on both Facebook and Instagram. It's 5 o'clock Mountain Time on Facebook and 5:30 Mountain Time on Instagram. But then those recordings are still there in IGTV or on Facebook. And I also upload those to YouTube. And it's called Friday Fromage from the Farm. And they are a short, 20, 25 minutes of something about cheese making or about a particular kind of cheese. So those are fun. I also will start back up again in the spring. I have another session called Monday Morning from the Milk House, and that's more about the goats and goat keeping. Since we're into kind of our off season now, I've sort of suspended that until spring when the babies start to arrive again. So those are all the ways to find me, or you can just email me directly, kate@theartofcheese.com.
Yeah, I've been a little jealous with you with your cheese and your wine because I was pregnant for a while, and I love wine because I'm from California, so like I've come from really good wine country, and I was just was like, oh, like cheese and wine, like, oh, I can't wait till I can drink wine again
You'll
and
get there.
only have cheese. um, but thank you so much. You are a rock star. I don't know how many of these you've done with me, but you always come with such an amazing attitude and just loving to talk and to share all you know. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you.
I'm glad we got
Yeah.
to do a one-on-one talk.
Yeah, that was fun because I can go on and on and on.
I could too, which
So,
is why I'm like, okay, I know I'm trying to be better about keeping to time because sometimes we go over and I try to be respectful of your guys' time, but
yeah,
I just want to sit here and talk forever.
yeah,
I,
yeah.
I go downstairs with my family and I'm just like all a buzz.
Well, now remember, you told me at the beginning before we started recording that you don't have a mentor yet, but you actually do because you've interviewed all these people all over the country, and they will all be there, myself included, to help mentor you through this next stage. So, I mean, we
Yeah,
appreciate that you've been putting this out for people too, because it is a really valuable resource for people wanting to get into either goat keeping or sheep keeping or cheese making, to kind of know that there is support out there and to demystify it a little bit, but also to have people to follow up with. So you've
yeah.
provided a really valuable service here for people as well.
And don't be afraid to reach out. I mean, I have not talked to anybody, even if they weren't able to make it onto one of these discussions. I have not interacted with anybody who was mean or dismissive. I mean, they've just all been
You
willing to
will
help
find
and
that,
loving it.
the small ruminant people are salt of the earth. I mean, no offense to the horse people. I have a big part of my world is in the horse world, but it's a different set of people than the small ruminant people. I have never found so many people willing to share their knowledge and their time. And so, yeah, you're right. You can ask just about anybody, and we love to talk about it and share what we've learned. So
I
I
don't think I
would
would have
agree.
continued getting into this if I didn't have so many people being so supportive. Random people, like people I've never actually met in person, but are so willing to share and help.
Yeah.
And to laugh, when you make a mistake, to be like, oh yeah, I was there too. I've done that
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
So I just want to kind of tell everybody out there that, if there's anyone that you kind of admire or that you're like, oh, they're doing something that I would just love to try. Um, just reach out to them. Again, most of the people on here are from Instagram. And I just messaged them and said, hey, I'm doing this thing. Do you want to join?
Yeah.
And most of them, even if they couldn't make it, were like, we love what you're doing and we're supporting you. Let us know when it's out. So, just don't be afraid to ask people for help if you need it.
Yeah, I always say it's the biggest compliment you can give a person is to ask them for advice. So don't be shy, and someday you will be the one giving advice. I always tell that to people when they thank me for helping them get them started in goats. I'm like, oh, you will be helping somebody else get started in goats someday. So
And
it's always a pay it forward.
what's really great from the beginner standpoint is kind of getting that teaching of how someone teaches somebody else.
Mm,
Kind of, all the talks I've talked with you guys, I'm absorbing like, okay, so if someone came up to me and asked all these questions, how do I answer that? Oh, well, this person, answered that question for me. So I'm going to share that with that other person. So
yeah.
it's just a definite like small community that hopefully will get bigger. Um, and that people will kind of get to know that how awesome ruminants are. That's kind of one of the
Yes.
reasons I started this, was just to share, that there's more to farming than just pigs and cows.
Yeah, for sure.
Because a
No
lot of
offense to them.
no
They
offense
have
to
their
them.
place in the world,
If
but
you
yes.
have the space and the capacity for that, that's amazing. But there's also, sheep and goats will be attracted. Certain personalities will be attracted to sheep and goats more than cows. Like it just personalities will just get attracted, I think, to different animals. And so if you're not a cow person, open your mind up to maybe some other things.
Yeah, yeah,
But
for
anyway,
sure.
I'm like, again, I could talk like this forever, but
Yeah.
I will give you your Sunday.
All right.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, Delaney. You're doing a great job.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, well, I can just kind of give you the general kind of idea of what the questions will be. Um, the first little bits is going to just be like, what is milk? Like, a lot of the questions I get are, can you even milk goat or sheep? So like, I want to address that, just to kind of, yes, you can. Really, technically, anything that's a mammal that, has a baby, you can technically milk. Um, I've heard of people milking camels and moose and
Mhm.
stuff. So I'm like, yes, you can.
Yes,
Um,
there's a camel milk CSA near us.
oh, really?
And there's a big camel milk producer out in eastern Colorado, a commercial one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Have you tasted it?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of salty, is the best
Really?
way I can describe it. It's kind of salty and minerally, and it's one of the few milks that's very hard to make cheese out of.
Okay.
So we tried and we made some cheese, but it's also super expensive. So it's not a very good milk to make cheese out of because you don't get very much cheese.
So what do they do with the milk?
It's supposed to have like really high nutrients. And believe it or not, a lot of parents of autistic kids
Oh,
really tout the benefits of camel milk for
interesting.
that condition. Yeah. And then other health conditions, it's just very nutrient dense.
Hmm. Interesting.
So,
I have
yeah.
a I have a lot of history of autism in my family, so that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the scientific evidence is for that, but
I can just imagine someone like me who's 5'3" trying to milk a a camel.
Yeah,
Like, I'm assuming they're
apparently.
just like standing.
Well, and they're not apparently, at least the CSA near us, they're not super cooperative. So they actually have to have a baby nursing on one
Mm.
side to get the mother to
Oh,
stand still. And then they're milking the other side, which means you get even less, right?
yeah.
Because
Wow.
baby's always getting half.
Well,
So
I don't think they're like cows where like they probably produce a ton.
I
Um,
wouldn't think so, although they
um,
are big
big
animals.
animals and the babies
But
are pretty
it's
big.
like $20 a quart. I mean, it's
Yeah,
really expensive.
I can imagine. And then with like, not being able to do too much with it, it's kind of interesting. Um,
Yeah.
like, would you be able to make yogurt out of it? Like, I don't. It'd be
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how big the market really is for it, but
Yeah.
and I am also happy to talk about sheep milk. I don't know a lot about sheep, but I know a little bit about sheep milk.
Well, and you know
So I
about
can
camel
talk
milk.
about
You know
yeah.
anything about donkey milk? I've heard
Well,
people do that one too.
oh yeah, pretty much all. If you were to go around the world, you would find almost every mammal's milk being turned into cheese.
Yeah.
So there's some wild donkey in like oh, where is it? It's way in Mongolia, I think, and it's the most expensive cheese that you can
Oh,
buy
I
is
can
from
imagine.
this one particular type of wild donkey.
Yeah,
So
I can imagine.
yeah,
I mean, I've heard people do like moose and stuff, and I'm like, oh wow. Like, I
and
want to kind
rain,
of try them all, but I'm like, I wouldn't want,
yeah,
wouldn't want
and
to milk.
reindeer milk cheese.
Yes,
That's yeah.
reindeer. Just very, very interesting when I was looking into like other options. Um, just because I was curious, I was like, so what do other people in other countries, milk? And a
Yeah,
lot of it's the goats. I mean, I think
yeah,
that like in Africa, I think it's more goats than sheep, but
yeah,
and then everywhere else, it's kind of like New Zealand, I think does more sheep.
yeah.
Um, I don't like Europe. I don't know if there's. I think it's more sheep than goat, but I'm not
Yeah, I think it's
100% sure.
fairly, I read it's
More even.
fairly comparable, but when I've been there, I've seen way more sheep than goats.
Oh, really?
So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, when we went to Scotland, I've been to Scotland twice, and it's always sheep, and I was like, I don't remember ever seeing goat. But yeah, so I don't know about. I think goats are more common in South America.
Yeah, goats, I think one reason they may not be in Europe as much is they don't do as well in humid climates as sheep do.
Mhm.
And so they do better in more dry and kind of rugged climates. So
Mhm.
a lot of times, even in countries that might not have a lot of goats, they tend to have their goats in more of the drier and rugged parts of the country.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I just did a class that included a cheese that called French Brisset, which is traditionally made in southern France in an area with a breed of goat called the Rove goat. And when you look at the pictures of where they're living, it really looks like rugged Colorado. I mean, it's just kind of dry and scrappy. And I just
Mhm.
don't know that the sheep would do as well there as the goats do.
Yeah, I know there's a difference between like Scotland and even like where Tennessee is, but we do get a lot of rain, which England has a lot of rain, so like it makes sense. I think we have a crossbreed, so like our East Frisians, which I think are is it German? I think Lucanes are French and East Frisians are German. Um, and they're crossed with the Gulf Coast because they needed a little bit more hardiness for
Yeah.
the humidity. So, it's really interesting for all those little things.